So like other synchronous classes, this particular session is not so much about going into the nitty-gritty of the texts that are in the syllabus and that we have discussed. Well, not really discussed, but I will be referring to them. So if you're able to take notes about where I mention certain texts, you can. That would be helpful. So today we'll be discussing the 20th and the 21st centuries, spanning roughly what is called the modern and the postmodern periods, and we'll kind of problematize this distinction between the modern period and the postmodern period. So again, this isn't going to be so much about the texts, but it's supposed to help you like have a more grounded understanding of the texts that we listed in the syllabus in relation to their particular historical period. So what we'll be discussing today are first the key historical events and intellectual currents that happened in the 20th and the 21st centuries that are particularly pertinent to the texts in our course. Second, we'll be discussing modernism in relation to periodization, themes, and aesthetics. And the third is we'll discuss briefly Jameson's essay on postmodernism or the cultural logic of late capitalism, which is one of the most comprehensive texts about that seeks to define what do we mean actually when we say postmodernity. Jameson's text is also often read in theory courses because of its particular concern. But I wanted to discuss it in this course because it helps us understand not only the postmodern period, what is called the postmodern period, but also the modern period. I chose this image as the cover. This is a painting titled Toadsmere Dead Sea by Paul Nash, and it concerns one of the landscapes of the Second World War. And I chose this image because it represents a lot of the themes that preoccupy these particular centuries. We see here this image of death, although we don't really see bodies. Okay, the images of destruction, playing with perspectives. If you notice, the image of warplanes are juxtaposed with the waves of the ocean. So if you're looking at it from afar, you might think that these are waves in the ocean, but when you look at it more closely, you'll see warplanes that are beached ashore. So it's playing with perspective, it's playing with perception, and it's also taking up that theme of destruction and the sense of dislocation, of confusion, dislocation, confusion, of destabilization. The 20th and the 21st centuries are characterized by relentless change, by loss. There's supposed to be a comma between loss and destabilization. What exactly changed? What was lost? What is destabilized? And this sort of concern with loss and change and destabilization is captured by that line that William Butler Yeats wrote in The Second Coming. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. The old certainties no longer are true. Those old certainties have been challenged, have broken. And that's that sense of loss is something that characterizes this age. Next slide. A rundown of the important events in these two centuries. So consider we're discussing 2 centuries. So one of the most important events of this century would be, one of the first events would be 1902, the end of the Anglo-Boer War in South Africa. So this was between the Boers in South Africa and Great Britain. And this happened right after Queen Victoria died in 1901. So usually the modern period is placed as beginning after the death of Victoria. So what happened in the Anglo-Boer War, this was one of the first wars of independence by a colony against the British Empire. So the South Africans wanted their own government and staged a revolt using guerrilla warfare, guerrilla tactics against the British. And the British responded by a scorched earth policy. If you recall Philippine history, howling wilderness, that phrase howling wilderness, when the Americans killed everyone on Samar Island. uh, it's the same. So a scorched earth policy basically means that you destroy everything you associate with the enemy. Because the Boers were using guerrilla warfare, meaning they were hiding in forests, they were hiding in farms, they were hiding among common like villagers. So what the British did was they razed entire villages to the ground. They razed entire farms, they razed entire forests in an attempt to kill off the enemy. So the extreme violence of this particular war laid a mark on the English consciousness. Remember how during the Victorian era there was a great emphasis placed on morality, on the Christian God, and you see that a lot in Jane Eyre, even when she's protesting against the patriarchal nature of Christian belief. She keeps referring back again to this idea of goodness and morality and the Christian deity and faith. So this war imprinted itself, the violence of this war imprinted itself on the British consciousness, such that even if they won the war, they knew that they won it at great cost, at the cost of genocide, at the cost of their own self-respect. At least for those of them who were conscious about these bigger social issues. So that's one important concern, and we will see this again in succeeding uprisings against the British Empire. What happened in the Anglo-Boer War would reproduce itself, or would happen again in other anti-colonial events and wars for independence. So in 1907, the settler colonies of Australia, Canada, and New Zealand were recognized dominions of the British Commonwealth. So when we say settler colonies, that means that these predominantly white people came to these territories that were occupied by indigenous populations and then colonized those territories. So the settler colonies in Australia, Canada, and New Zealand were predominantly white because they've been settled by these British people. So those colonies, which had a predominantly white population, because they've already killed off the natives, right? So these colonies with predominantly white populations were granted dominion status. So when you have dominion status, it means you have a right to self-government. So even though they're recognized as still part of the British Empire, the British Commonwealth, they're still granted some recognition of independent self-rule. By the way, if I begin talking too fast and if you don't understand what I'm saying anymore, just raise your hand or write it in the comments. In 1916, the Easter Rising happened. So Irish nationalists revolted against British rule, and this has been a very long conflict in the making because Ireland is predominantly Catholic. The British at that time was predominantly Protestant, and throughout the British literary history, you would see this conflict between Catholicism, Protestantism, but also because of the colonial dynamics between the imperial center in London and the more impoverished territories in Ireland. So the Irish were a colony, like formally a colony of Great Britain, and like other colonies of Great Britain, they were also already beginning to campaign for self-rule. So what you see here is a pattern in the 20th and 21st centuries of the destabilization of British imperial identity. If you remember, during the Romantic period, 18th century, late 18th century, early 19th century, during the Romantic period, we saw a rise of nationalism in Britain. And these Romantic poets were also trying to figure out how to construct and represent the British nation. If you remember, Wordsworth and his friends were identifying Englishness, English national identity with the hearth, with the home, with the English countryside, with the common people. So the original, or during that time, in the Romantic period, British national identity was quite pastoral, was quite provincial. But during the Victorian period, that provincial national identity changed. Suddenly, British national, not suddenly, but during the Victorian period, British national identity became an imperial identity. As we discussed during Victoria's reign, three-fourths of the globe uh, was ruled, three-fourths or a quarter, under British rule. So imagine that's almost a century of Britain having this imperial identity, and with the rise of nationalist and anti-colonial movements, with Britain's costly wars, that imperial identity also started disintegrating, and that's one of the bases or anchors of loss and destabilization during the modern period. So you'll see that also in, we'll talk more about this later when we discuss the Edwardian period, but we'll see this sense of insecurity in Proofrock. And a lot of you mentioned that in the discussion prompts. Like some of you were advising, like, it's gonna be difficult to have a relationship with this man because he's so insecure. He's questioning himself at every turn. That self-questioning, that self-consciousness is also a characteristic of this modern period, where suddenly the British Empire had, not suddenly, I keep saying suddenly, but it's not suddenly, it's like a series of processes and events. But during that time, they had the beginnings of a national identity crisis. If we are not an empire, who are we? Because they could never return to the Wordsworthian pastoral identity. That identity is gone now. They've already experienced being the rulers of the world. So now that decolonization was happening, who are we now? And that was a big problem that confronted the British then, and it is still confronting them now as we see British global power waning and waning, especially with reference to the rise of U.S. empire. And we'll talk more about that. So World War I happened in 1914 to 1918. So again, this period is one that is sandwiched by wars and wars and wars, which also contributes to that sense of loss and disruption of everyday life. So 1914 to 1918, World War I, which was a predominantly European war. World War I, and then other important events during this time: women's suffrage in 1918, women over 30 were granted voting rights. In 1928, women over 21 were granted voting rights. And these movements for women's suffrage were accomplished after much militant agitation. So women were conducting boycotts, bombings, and hunger strikes in order to fight for the right to vote. In 1929, we had the global stock market crash. If you remember, one of our readings for the Victorian period concerned how the British Empire also built a lot of its wealth by becoming the banker of the world. So in 1929, we had the global stock market crash, one of the first big financial crisis under capitalism. And this was the beginning of the Great Depression, which affected not just Great Britain, but also the United States and the rest of the world. So the Great Depression also saw the rise of fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany. The Great Depression led to a lot of poverty, led to unemployment, to inflation, to the raising of the standards and costs of living. And it also led to rising inequality, because not everyone lost money in the Great Depression. Some people were making billions even when there was a Great Depression. So fascism and Nazism as social movements in Italy and Germany began as social democratic movements or social justice movements. These were made up by organized workers and organized peasants calling for more state support, calling for the redistribution of resources. But that social justice element, this call for a more equitable distribution of resources, also devolved to totalitarianism, authoritarianism, centralist control of the entire party state, and that's a concern that you see in works like George Orwell's Animal Farm. If you remember, in that text, we begin with the animals fighting for their rights, and then it quickly devolves into this dictatorial arrangement with the pigs, the fascist pigs, lording it over everyone. So these events were also something that affected the consciousness of the writers of this age. So we have a decade of economic depression, and then we have another 5 to 6 years of war. Ironically, it was war that helped ease the Great Depression because of how much money was being made by the trade in arms, by the acquisition of more territories. Usually, war is waged because you want more resources. So these two things, the stock market crash because of the financial speculation of capitalists. So stock market crash, Great Depression, rise of authoritarian movements, and the waging of new wars. These are all related, and they feed into one another. So under Nazi Germany, World War II, of course, began with Hitler's invasion of Poland. And if you remember, during World War II, the three allies, Axis powers, the so-called evil guys of World War II, were Italy, Japan, and Germany. And the Soviet Union was an ally of the United Kingdom. And that alliance was what angered Orwell so much because of how he disapproved of the central state system, the totalitarian system of the Soviet Union under Stalin. And under Stalin kasi Leninism, which was more like Leninism focused on revolutionary violence as a way to throw off the yoke of capitalism and imperialism. But under Stalin, that revolutionary violence turned conservative in the sense that it became under the monopolistic control of the central state. So the primary policy of Soviet Russia under Stalin was central planning. So he planned, the planners in Moscow planned the economy, planned the prices of goods, planned the distribution of resources, everything. So with that central state, and we will also see this in Maoist China, you had a lot of corruption and also a lot of mismanagement of the economy. So millions of people died of hunger during the period of Stalinist Russia because of the mismanagement of the economy. So people like Orwell were very pessimistic and critical of Soviet Russia under Stalin. So even though some of these intellectuals during the modern period supported communism, a lot of them also eventually wrote against communism because of how it was carried out in Maoist China and Stalinist Russia. World War II. In World War II, so 1929, Great Depression, World War II. As we know, Great Britain, with the support of the United States, which entered the war in the 1941 after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. So before 1941, before the United States entered the war, because at the beginning, the US was still pretending neutrality, if you remember. But then the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. So the US were like, no, you're not going to bomb our colony in Hawaii, so we're going to start the war. We're going to enter the war. Before the US entered the war, Britain was already losing. But with the infusion of American capital and American military might, that helped Britain win that war. But after the war, what were the repercussions, the results of that war? First, we saw the waning of the British Empire. And again, since the 1902, this was already beginning. But the war really speeded up that process because during the war, Britain lost so many territories. It also lost a lot of money in waging that war. With the loss of British military might, like you have hundreds, thousands, millions of soldiers dying in that war. With the loss of military might or the diminution of military might, that was a plus for a lot of these colonies who were already waging anti-colonial movements. So imagine you're in a colony, your colonizer weakens because of that war. So these colonies had like were able to mount a stronger opposition to anti-colonial were able to mount a stronger opposition to colonial rule. So in winning the war, Great Britain lost an empire. These page numbers, by the way, are from the Norton anthology. So if you notice, I included background information for each module, so you can refer to that there. So as I was saying earlier, this also prompted a national identity crisis. Okay, so 1949. So just going through all of this, as these are important historical contexts for the texts. 1949 to 1976, we had the rise of global Maoism as Mao Zedong won the civil war in China against Chiang Kai-shek, who fled to Taiwan. So when Mao Zedong gained control of this and extremely huge and powerful territory, China, we also saw the rise of global Maoism. The Communist Party under Mao trained a lot of communists around the world, especially from the so-called non-aligned nations of the Third World. So World War II again led to the waning of Great Britain as an imperial power. It led to the rise of the United States as a new global imperial power. And it also led to the explosion of new nation states. So most of the nation states, most of the countries that we now have at present, trace their origins to the anti-colonial nationalist movements during and in the wake of World War II. So the Cold War post-war is characterized by this scramble or this conflict between the so-called first and second world for influence in the third world. So the first world, these are your capitalist democracies. Many of them are old states, old nation states. When I say old, meaning they emerged before World War II. So there's a conflict between the first world, the capitalist democracies, and the second world. These are your communist, often totalitarian states. And their conflict are often presented as a race against each other. But you can ask, like, a race for what? A race for whom? A race for influence over where? And what is often absent in that narrative of the Cold War is the significance of these newly decolonized or decolonizing states in the so-called third world, which constitutes the majority of the world. So the Cold War was a conflict between communism and capitalism for influence over the majority of the world, comprised now by these new nation states. So Cold War. 1947, India and Pakistan become independent nations. And again, this is significant because of how important India was to the British Empire. A lot of the wealth that the British made during the Victorian period was because they were able to control the trade with India, which was a very, very rich continent. They were able to exploit not just Indian natural resources, but also Indian labor. So the fact that India became independent from Britain in 1947 was a huge blow also to the British Empire. India and Pakistan also partitioned in 1947. So when you hear the partition, that pertains to the separation of India and Pakistan, because India is a majority Hindu state and Pakistan is a majority Muslim state. So we see this conflict between India and Pakistan up to the present day. With the conflict, for example, in Kashmir. And in 1948, the British withdraw from Palestine, and we see that conflict happening until now. Before 1948, Palestine was already asserting its independence, but at the same time, Palestine at that when it was asserting its independence, it was also in conflict with the colonization of the Israeli state. The Holocaust, the killing of 6 million Jews, also is part of a broader problem for Jews all around the world, where now that they have no home, where can they live? And the United Nations at that time identified Palestine as a country for the displaced Jewish population. But there were already people living in Palestine at that time, Palestinians. So the arrival of Israelis, the arrival of Jewish people who are Jews to predominantly Muslim Palestine was also another source of conflict. And the British were like, we don't care about that anymore. You figure that out. We're withdrawing from Palestine. After 1948, so 1957 to 1962, we have more British colonies being able to assert their independence from Great Britain. So why did I spotlight all of these things? Because often absent from our discussion of British literature is how much or the British Empire and its eventual dissolution contributed so much to current geopolitical conflicts that we see today. And these geopolitical conflicts have inflicted trauma not only to British citizens, but also to the citizens of these formerly colonized countries that have been displaced, and then have come to Britain. Many of them, because of their search for a homeland when their or a new home when their homelands have been devastated. As we will discuss later in this presentation, this wave of decolonization and migration to the erstwhile imperial center would be the greatest influence on the development of contemporary British literature. This arrival of new voices, new forms, new identities, new cultures from the formerly colonized territories under the British Empire is the biggest influence on contemporary British literature. So that's why I spotlighted these events here. Okay, 1979 to 1990, Thatcher becomes the Prime Minister of Great Britain. And with her alliance with the United States under Reagan, we had the globalization of neoliberalism, which heralds the retreat of the welfare state and the privatization of interests, etc., etc. So this is an important context actually for Jameson's discussion of the postmodern condition, which is characterized by the commodification of everything. The globalization of neoliberalism, which as a political and economic policy is about privatization, the retreat of the state from control of the economic sphere, the retreat of the state from the provision of public welfare services. So the commodification of everything that Jameson talks about is rooted in this economic and political development. In 1979, Deng Xiaoping in China opens up the Chinese economy. So before, under Mao, China was the economy of China, because it was a communist state under Mao. It avoided trade with the Western world, so it was closed economically. Under Deng Xiaoping, after the death of Mao in 1976, under Deng Xiaoping, China opened up to the world again under Deng's program of the modernization in agriculture, industry, defense, and science and technology. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. With the collapse of the Soviet Union heralds supposedly the end of the Cold War, or the conflict between capitalism and communism, supposedly. So when you hear phrases like the end of history, that pertains to the fall of the Soviet Union, which at that time was one of the two major communist powers, along with communist China. But again, by 1979, China was not really communist anymore. It was just nominally communist, but it already adopted capitalist capitalist forms of production in line with so-called modernization. 1991, another big one of the another significant development in the development another significant development in the evolution, I don't know, of British literature. You had the globalization of the internet. So from being a niche military technology, the internet in 1991 became globalized. By 2004, most people in the world, or not most, a sizable population around the world had access to and were using the internet. In 2004, you had the mainstreaming of Web 2.0, or the mainstreaming of social media. So before 2004, the web was not as dynamic as it is today. The Web 2.0 is characterized with more interactivity in the use of the internet. So if you're exploring, for example, hypertext literature or other very contemporary forms of literature, it might be worth looking into the history of the internet and how that has revolutionized the way we perceive the world, the way we consume information, the way we produce representation, the way that we organize knowledge. 1997, handover of Hong Kong from the British to the Chinese. So here again is another marker of the waning of British power in contemporary geopolitics. And 2001, we have the beginning of the war on terror with the 9/11 bombings in New York. So the war on terror is one of those great series of great wars that sandwich this period. So if you look at this timeline, sorry if that seems a bit like too much, a bit. So I just wanted to emphasize how much these developments, especially these series of wars and social movements, and how much this contributed to the formation of what we understand as modernity and postmodernity. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. So some of the major themes that characterize the modern period: the rise of individualism, especially self-consciousness and interiority. What accounts for that? Some of the things that account for that would be the rise of related knowledges like psychoanalysis, which allowed us a more complicated view of the human self and ways of representing subjectivity. This is also, the rise of individualism is also associated with a trend that we already observed during the Victorian period, which was mass migration and urbanization. So suddenly the individual was plucked from his traditional community, migrated to the city, a place of crowding and anonymity. So divorced or plucked from his community roots, the individual then had to find or construct a new identity for himself in a place, the city, where he is anonymous, where no one knows him. Maybe where if he moved there without family and friends, away from his hometown, away from the expectations of the people who knew him, suddenly the individual had to construct himself. So the rise of urbanization and the rise of mass literacy and the mass production of representational forms like the newspaper and the novel allowed also for this new consciousness of individuality and the individual's ability to construct himself. So in the modern period, we have this preoccupation with the self, with interiority, with subjectivity. Another thing that preoccupies the modern period is nationalism, which is also kind of associated with individualism. For example, if you ask, what is the modern person? If you have a question like, what is the modern person? The modern person is able to think for himself or herself. The modern person is self-conscious. He is conscious of himself as an individual. And that consciousness, again, is enabled by urbanization, the rise of new forms of knowledge, the rise of an awareness of history. So the modern person is um, is distinct, is distinguished by his self-consciousness, by his ability to identify himself as different from preceding periods in history. And again, that consciousness is only possible because he has knowledge of previous periods in history. So recall again that during the Victorian period, there arose these different hard and social sciences. The discipline of history, sociology, anthropology, archaeology, biology, all of these things started becoming institutionalized and codified during the Victorian period. So by the time of the modern period, the modern man knew not only like Greek and Roman classics, the knowledge of late antiquity, but he also had knowledge of these modern sciences, which allowed him again to see himself and his existence at this present period as distinctly separate from and different to past periods. So that's part of individualism. Nationalism, although this is older, like nationalism, as we discussed in previous modules, already began to arise in Europe in the 18th century, in the as early as the late 17th century or 18th century, around that time, when you had the consciousness of along with the arrival of print capitalism, as Benedict Anderson reminds us. But nationalism in the modern period is intensified by anti-colonial movements, because these not suddenly, I keep saying suddenly, I shouldn't say suddenly, but anyway, anti-colonial nationalist movements. So the formerly colonized, by their exposure to the values of the Enlightenment, in the Victorian period and in the early modern period, they also imbibed the sense of their distinctness, their distinct national identity. And with this awareness of distinctness, collective, communal distinctness, also arose the desire for self-governance. Because because they recognize that what they desired for themselves, for example, may not be what their ruler desires for them. Like this notion of difference also gave rise to this desire for self-rule. So nationalism is also a big preoccupation of the 20th and 21st centuries, especially in relation to independence and the formation of a collective identity and a collective sense of imagined community. Decolonization, I already spoke about in the previous slide. We also had the rise of mass migration, especially international and intercontinental migration. So in the previous period, mass migration was usually intercity. I think we discussed a bit about that in relation to Manchester becoming an industrial city. But here you had migration on a more global scale. So that's the mass migration of people on a global scale also led to the pluralization of societies. So maybe in the 15th century, in Shakespeare's time, you only saw mostly white people in London. But with the rise of mass migration on a global scale, you had the cities changed to become more cosmopolitan, to become more plural, to be more of a mixture of different races, different languages, different cultures. Or migration. We also saw the continuing trend of urbanization, as accelerated by new technologies like the television, the developments in telecommunications and transportation contributed to, again, urbanization. This period also saw the rise of mass production and consumption, again, enabled also by the development of technologies and ways of distributing them. This period is also characterized by globalization, enabled by technological advancements, which resulted in the sense of accelerated time and the contraction and transformation of space. So maybe in the 19th century, a trip to India from the United Kingdom would take maybe 2 to 3 months. But in the age of globalization, that could be just a 12-hour flight away. So imagine that, and it was actually this time it's actually sudden because of the pace of technological advancement. Suddenly, the world became smaller. So the concept of the global village also emerges in this period. That even though I am sitting in a small room in Quezon City, I might know what is happening halfway across the globe in Palestine or Afghanistan or wherever, because of how connected everything suddenly becomes. And it really was sudden. Because another thing that characterizes the modern age is speed. The speed with which developments occur, the speed with which changes happen. So that's also that speed of change, of mutability, aside from the wars, just the speed of changes is also something that contributed to the sense of loss and destabilization that is the major theme of this period. Because society was changing so fast, or technology was changing so fast, that it was difficult for society to catch up. Like you didn't know anymore what the norms are, because the norms keep changing. For example, when I came back to teaching this year after 4 years of not teaching Filipinos, I was teaching in Hong Kong, and it's a kind of a different context there. But when I came back here and started teaching again, I was surprised by how normal stating your pronouns are. Like when I ask students to introduce themselves, they would mention their pronouns, and that wasn't a thing 4 years ago. Just 4 years ago, in the space of 4 years, so much changed. Other things that change in this period of in the modern period, even cities change. The pace not only of technological development, but also how rapidly cities are changing, such that the city that you remember from your childhood, when you come back to it after just a decade or even just 5 years, the city already looks different. So that also leads to a sense of loss and confusion, that even your memory cannot keep up with the pace of change. And that's something that, again, characterizes this period. And I keep mentioning this because with this sense of loss and confusion and not being able to keep pace, this situation created new challenges for the writers of this period. The challenge to represent new realities, the challenge um, to evolve or to innovate, the challenge to innovate new literary forms that can adequately represent new realities. And the new here is not just an adjective. A lot of things were really new. I grew up without the internet, or at least I grew up before the internet became globally accessible. So the internet as a technology is also something that's new to me, and I still remember the time when we didn't have the internet, and if I wanted to look up something, I had to go to an actual library, or go to my neighbor and check their encyclopedia. Like I still remember that time. I still remember watching the same TV shows as everyone else, because those were your only mass distribution channels. But with the advent of the internet, so many things changed, and so our literary forms for representing those new realities also had to change, and that's another thing that influenced this period. So acceleration of time, contraction and transformation of space, hybridity or the mixing of different cultures creating new forms, pluralism, the complexification of societies, multiculturalism, locality, where the local is at once global and distinctly local. the globalization of neoliberalism, Pax Americana, or the rise of the American peace, so-called peace under the U.S. empire that rests on wars, wars, wars. These are all preoccupations of the modern and the postmodern period. Modernism, periodization. So how do we usually periodize modernism? The first period would be High Modernism, 1901 to 1920. So if you look at the reading list, for instance, T.S. Eliot, Tradition and the Individual Talent, the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, even the works, some of the works by Yeats, because Yeats writes throughout the span of the modern period. So the early William Butler Yeats also falls into here. So High Modernism of 1901 to the 1920s. So this is usually divided into the Edwardian period, 1901 to 1914, and it stops at the breaking out of World War One. This period was characterized by the remnants of the social stability and economic prosperity of the Victorian era. So by this time, or during this time, the Great Britain still had most of its colonies. So we still had that economic prosperity and that sense of British dominance over the world. So materially, geopolitically, it seems like little has changed. Queen Victoria just died. But culturally, a lot was changing. We had, and this again is connected to different forms of knowledge and intellectual currents that were happening at that time. Consider, for instance, that during the late Victorian period, Marxism became mainstream. In the realm of political economic theory, Marxism became more mainstream. And again, Marxism emphasizes the oppression that inheres in the relations between different classes in society. So whereas before social hierarchy was taken as something for granted, like it was just the way that the world was organized, Marxism made obvious that this is not natural, that these hierarchical relations in society are not natural. Rather, they are based on how we distribute resources, who owns the means of production, who has control over the means of economic productivity, who holds the means of production. They also control the superstructure, the values and norms and beliefs of society. So with the arrival of Marxism, suddenly, not again suddenly, but people realize that a lot of the things that we take for granted as natural, they're not natural. They are something that is man-made, and that's something that we can change. So you had the rise of like organized social movements, etc. So in the realm of political economic theory, there was that. In the realm of politics, you had the rise of democracy and movements for universal suffrage, for the democratization of power in society. So you had that there. In the realm of science, during the Victorian period, again, you had Darwin preaching evolution and the perfectibility of human society. But so on the one hand, because Darwin made these discoveries during the Victorian period, but it also affected people in the modern period. So on the one hand, the theory of evolution seemed to promise the perfectibility of civilization, because Darwin had this pattern of presented this pattern of how creatures, in order to better survive in their ecology, in their ecosystem, they evolved characteristics. So they, like thinkers during that time, used this idea of evolution and applied it also to human society. So early modernists and late Victorians thought that human society could be perfectible if we just progressed or evolved generation after generation. So on the one hand, that was the promise of evolution. But on the other hand, the Darwin's theory of evolution also raised the concern or the awareness that man is not so special in the scheme of creation. Like man is descended from animals, or that's this oversimplification of Darwin's theory, that man was descended from apes, from animals. So what distinguishes humanity from a monkey? So with that connection, you had that, because Darwin's Darwin's discoveries were extremely controversial because they challenged the Victorian belief, or the belief of earlier periods, that man came from God, that man's position in on earth is superior to that of other creatures because man was fashioned in the image of God's likeness, etc. And then suddenly you have the scientists telling you, no, you actually came from apes. So that was a huge, huge thing. Um, the rise of that kind of scientific inquiry in relation to, for example, in the realm of philosophy, Nietzsche pronouncing that God is dead. What Nietzsche was saying then um, was that our belief systems are also not natural, like they are also constructed. Our entire system of moral values is not something that descended to us from heaven, but it is constructed by societies and institutions like the church. Nietzsche was very critical of Christian morality for supposedly promoting slave mentality with its focus on conformity and obedience and humility. So all of these intellectual currents coming together in philosophy, Nietzsche, in the sciences, Darwin, in economics, Marx, in sociology, Weber, if you want to be English about it, but Weber, talking about alienation and social stratification. So all of these intellectual currents coming together gave rise to a sense of skepticism or distrust of the old narratives. Suddenly, at this time, the old beliefs, the old narratives about who we are, what our place in society is, what our values should be, these old narratives came to be challenged during the modern period. So you had disillusionment about religion and faith. You had the shattering of confidence in inherited knowledges about humanity's basic rationality, uh, the idea of what is knowable and thus representable. Uh, Reality itself during the modern period came to be challenged. And that's something that distinguishes again the modern and the postmodern periods from earlier periods. And later on, we'll talk more a bit about what distinguishes then the modern from the postmodern period. I'll go to the next slide. So the first period, because modernism spans a century basically, and the earliest part of this was high modernism, where again, politically and economically, it seems like things are the same. Like the engines of the industrial revolution are still running, empire is still healthy and okay, etc. But culturally, intellectually, a lot was happening that characterizes high modernism. Um, Another thing that I forgot to put in the slides, but another thing that characterizes the period of high modernism was the preoccupation with stylistic innovation, especially in the arts and literature. Because if reality was not what we thought it was, when reality was being questioned, how then can we come up with new vocabularies, new forms for representing this reality? And I think I mentioned that earlier already, but that destabilization of reality itself is one impetus for the drive to innovate new literary forms. So James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, Virginia Woolf, all of these people tried to be more inventive in their use of form, language, etc. So, for example, in Eliot, in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, he relies a lot on allusion, allusiveness, referentiality, intertextuality. And as I mentioned, I think last meeting, that's also related to what he wrote in Tradition and the Individual Talent, where he argues that what makes a modern writer is his awareness of the literary tradition that came before him. So how do you demonstrate that awareness? Through allusion, and intertextuality, referentiality, etc. So this poem by Eliot, Prufrock, demonstrates a lot of not a lot, but demonstrates that drive to refer to tradition, but also to innovate new forms for capturing human interiority, human experience, and subjectivity. The second period under modernism would be, and actually under postmodernism, because postmodernism, okay, I should probably mention at this point that it's still debated whether postmodernism is actually a distinct break from modernism. Because if we just look at literary techniques, preoccupations with new realities and new representational forms, preoccupations uh, with the with the destabilization of old certainties, preoccupation with charting the multiplicity of time and places and voices. If we just look at those themes that I presented earlier, we see a lot of continuity between modernism and postmodernism. So in this slide, I followed the way that Norton periodized these periods, which it does as a continuity. That postmodernism is another phase in modernism, but it is distinguished, as Jameson argues, by the commodification of everything. That even the art that we produce seeks to reproduce commodities, or even the art that we produce to survive must become commodities, must serve the engines of capital. So that's one argument that Jameson makes. So going back to this periodization, the second modernist period would be the reaction against the high modernism of the earlier period. So in high modernism, there was a great focus and spotlight on subjectivity, on mundane individual experience, on interiority. And during the period of reaction to high modernism, it saw again a turn between, a turn to a return to this kind of social realism and moralism that was more prevalent during the Victorian period. And one reason for that is because this period was sandwiched by financial crises and world wars. So the writers of this period felt that they had to represent these injustices and violence in society. The difference between the social realism and moralism of this period with that of the Victorian period is that the Victorians still had a very basic belief in human goodness, in conventional morality. But the realism during the 1930s and 1950s had no such certainties about the goodness of human nature. Because what happened during World War One and World War Two, you had genocides, people killing millions of other people. The Holocaust, 6 million Jews killed in death chambers, gas chambers, and then dumped in mass graves. Um, Japan being bombed by the Allied powers. I remember how the United States bombed entire cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Suddenly, one moment or one day, there were these two cities with bustling populations. You had buildings and people and schools and hospitals, etc. And then the United States dropped that bomb, and suddenly there were no more cities. One moment you had two cities, the next moment you had no cities. And everything was poisoned, and animals were mutating, and the seas were toxic, and radiation was causing defects in birth, etc. So the trauma of those world wars put this basic faith in humanity into question. What is human when we were capable of this much violence? So the realism of this period is quite different from the realism of the Victorian period with its beliefs in God and goodness. Now there was no God, and we're killing each other. So it was also during this time that I think it was Adorno who said that after the Holocaust, poetry is impossible, because how can you wax poetic? How can you lyricize about this violence? It felt immoral to even write poetry when so much violence was happening in the world. So again, we had this turn to social realism, documentary endeavors, the representation of reality as it was, in all of its ugliness and violence and dirt and sadness. So 1930s to 1950s. Hey. I get so impassioned by discussing modernity. Bakit? It's an exciting time in it's an exciting time actually, in a depressing way, but it was exciting because a lot of the problems and concerns we're grappling now had its roots in this period. So for me, when I was discussing like romanticism and the Victorian age, those periods felt a bit removed from me. Like I know and I can see how we are influenced by these older literary and cultural trends and movements. But when we get to the modern period, it feels more real because it's closer to us and all the issues that we're grappling with now. So 1930s, 1950s, and the 1960s and that collapse and the pluralization of societies also led to a lot of these social movements for civil rights, especially in the United States and the UK, which had a significantly large black population. So civil rights movements, women's rights, gay rights, environmentalism, anti-war demonstrations, especially with the Vietnam War, anti-nuclear energy demonstrations, because of what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and also what happened in Chernobyl, where there was a huge spill of radioactive material, and a lot of mutations and deaths also happened there. So there were demonstrations against the use of nuclear energy. You had the rise of bohemianism, hippie culture, sexual liberation, drugs, Maoism, punk, and rock and roll. So even Maoism then, in the West at least, was seen as a countercultural movement. So it was fashionable for young hippies in the 1960s and the 1970s to read Mao's Little Red Book, and that was part of the counterculture at that time. Again, in response to the dominant capitalist culture. So 1960s onward, decolonization and post-colonialism, and the assertion of the fictiveness of various realisms. Because then during this time, people recognize that white experience, the experience of some white guy living in London in the 1970s is very, very different from the experience of a black Jamaican woman living in London in the same time period. So the fictiveness of our realities and how those realities are shaped by our particular positions in society, this became more obvious during this period, because again, cities became more multicultural, became more complex. People were more likely to encounter the other than before. So otherness became mundane, otherness became commonplace. So we became more aware of how different other people's experiences are. It's 7 p.m. and this class is technically done. So if you need to go, just feel free to go. But I will continue discussing this because I'll just be uploading this to our class drive. So if you need to go again, please feel free to leave the call. But since this call is recording, I will continue talking and then upload this lecture to our class drive. So let me go on. Sorry again for making this so long. You know what? Next semester I'll schedule more synchronous classes para hindi parang info dump whenever we have a synchronous class. Anyway, these are some of the preoccupations again of modernity. I've already discussed most of this in the earlier slides, so I won't rehearse them here, but I'll just keep it here so you can refer to it later. So If we go back to our structures of modern period, key historical events, and then key thematic preoccupations, and now we have some characteristics of modernist and postmodernist aesthetics. Naubusan ako ng boses kasi I'm projecting my voice too much. Let me modulate my voice. Um, I put modernist and postmodernist aesthetics together because they share a lot of commonalities. Again, if you ask Jameson what distinguishes modernism from postmodernism is the role of modernist culture of postmodernist cultural production in relation to global capitalism. So for Jameson, that's actually what distinguishes both. So it's because Jameson is a Marxist, right? So his view of culture also rests on the awareness of the material basis of culture. So postmodern and modernist aesthetics are characterized by the dialogue between antiquity and contemporaneity, and this is rooted in, for instance, what Eliot says in Tradition in the Individual Talent, that the modern writer has an awareness and working knowledge of the traditions, the literary traditions that came before him. So when modern writers write, it is assumed that they have that existing awareness of previous traditions. And it is assumed that they must, by necessity, implicitly or explicitly dialogue with the traditions that came before them. So this dialectic relation between antiquity or tradition and contemporaneity is something that characterizes modernist writing. So even if you're taking CW creative writing in this day and age, the 21st century, you're still reading the canon. And that's part of your training, and that's part of that dialogue. Second characteristic of modernist aesthetics, I must say, by the way, that this is not comprehensive because another thing that distinguishes these periods is the explosion in experimentation, in the playfulness with style. So it's really it's it's dangerous to oversimplify the diversity and complexity of the styles that burgeoned in this period, but these are some characteristics. And again, this is not comprehensive or exhaustive, but these are some characteristics, yeah. So fascination with modernization and speed. So you'll see that, for instance, in the novels of Virginia Woolf, where you have a lot of descriptions of mobility, the movement from place to place, and the speed with which that mobility happens. This is not as obvious in what we read, like A Room of One's Own, because it's primarily set in Oxbridge, right? That essay, that long essay, was primarily set in one place. But if you read her other novels, she traverses space and time as if they're all like easily traversed. So the speed and the contraction of time is and the mobility that is afforded to the characters of her novels exemplifies or manifests this fascination with speed that is brought about by modernization and modern developments. Another thing that we find in this period, the fascination with utopian and dystopian visions. And this is why I included the short stories and the novella by Forster, The Machine Stops and the Other Side of the Hedge. Forster presents a more dystopic vision of society because other writers that during this period were more optimistic about technological developments, but so there were imaginations of what these technological developments could enable in the development of human civilization. So there were imaginations about the end of work, making the machines do everything for us, and then we can just focus on living good lives and creating art, etc. So there were more utopian visions of how society could be with the affordances of modern technology. But Forster presents more dystopic visions of a society where everything is mediated by technology such that we lose direct access to other people. We lose direct access to human experience. We become almost like machines ourselves. Or either we become like machines ourselves, or we are caught up in the logic of the machine, where we just go on and on and on, and we don't stop. Or yeah, like we're preoccupied with this forward movement, and then we lose sight of where we're going, why we're doing this. We just follow the logic of the machine. So utopian and dystopian visions, especially with regard to the machine, to technology, is also something that characterizes this period. We also have the growth of regional voices, localism, colloquialism, and this is partly because the National Arts Council in Great Britain started decentralizing funding to the arts. So there were arts councils in different um, areas, locations in Great Britain, and this helped to develop more regional cultural production. And you see that even today with the discourse of creative cities, which is mainstream in the United Kingdom. So the idea that if you want to develop your city, you have to make it creative, and the creative city has to be locally based. So these trends began in the modern period and are still ongoing today. If you're interested in that, the discourse of creative cities as an engine of capitalist development. So again, what Jameson said about that. That would be an interesting paper problem, no? Creative industries and how this discourse of the creative industry has harnessed artistic production to the demands of global capital. So yeah, regional voices, growth of regional voices and colloquial language. So now the English wasn't just BBC English. You had different Englishes. Even within Britain, you had different Englishes. What pa in the colonies, where you had also the rise of the recognition of world Englishes. Other things that characterize modernist and postmodernist aesthetics: self-consciousness or reflexivity about language, form, narrative, and meaning. So you see the rise of referentiality, intertextuality, or these practices of referring to other texts, either explicitly or implicitly in the text in order to explode meaning. Because whenever you allude to something, whenever you refer to something, you are expanding the meaning of the text beyond the text itself. Suddenly, when you, not, ayan na naman yung suddenly, I'm so sorry. Whenever you allude, whenever you include an intertextual reference, you are expanding the horizon of interpretation of the text to include that which you are alluding to or referring to. And we see that a lot in Prufrock. Whenever he refers to, for example, Hamlet, then when Prufrock compares himself to Polonius in Hamlet, our interpretation of Prufrock's character then is not limited to the characteristics that Eliot writes in the poem about his being old and balding and concerned with his necktie. Hindi na lang yun. We then associate his character with Polonius in Hamlet. And that reference only makes sense if you have read Hamlet. So this self-consciousness about how we construct narrative and meaning by conscious reference and allusion is something that characterizes modernist aesthetics. And again, that is enabled by an existing wealth of knowledge of tradition. And that the significance of tradition is also something that Virginia Woolf talks at length in A Room of One's Own when she discusses the library. Here we also see the rise of the genre of metafiction, which is a form of fiction that calls attention to its own fictiveness. For example, by breaking the fourth wall or consciously subverting narrative tropes or narrative expectations. So that self-consciousness of metafiction is also part of this. Other characteristics, I've already spoken about this, like formal experimentation, literary innovation, search for new ways of representing. Some examples of these new ways of representation although they're not completely new, but they present themselves as new, which were prevalent during the period of high modernism, includes the Imagist movement led by Ezra Pound, who was like super close friends with T.S. Eliot. He was the one who first published T.S. Eliot. Pound and Eliot are both Americans living in London. So, but they're included in the canon of English literature because they were literarily active in London. So the Imagist movement focused on the precision and concreteness of imagery against romantic emotionalism and Victorian discursiveness, or the tendency of Victorians like me to go on and on and on and on to discuss various things. So brevity and compression characterize imagism. So that poem about the petals on a bough, that's like a classic poem of imagism. Petals on a the apparition, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. So that two-line poem by Ezra Pound is characteristic of the aesthetic of the imagists, which focus on, again, precision, brevity, concreteness of imagery, the direct treatment of the thing, be the thing a subjective state like sadness, or whether it is an objective state like commuters on a train. It also focuses on the complexity and complexification of meaning through symbolism, irony, and allusion. So if you look at, for example, the operation of symbolism, symbolism also expands or layers meaning because the symbol means both itself and what it symbolizes. So the apple, the red apple, when you see a red apple in a narrative, the red apple means the literal red apple, but it might also symbolize temptation, sin, passion, all the things that we associate with red apples. Snow White, Eve, Adam and Eve. So symbolism complexifies meaning by layering it. Same with irony, because when you employ irony, you have a literal meaning, but when you're being ironic, you are also introducing a more sarcastic or possibly paradoxical or contradictory meaning. So irony also plays with how we interpret meaning. I already discussed how allusion complexifies meaning. Other things that characterize imagism, the insistence on free verse so that you can capture more directly experience. So if you're, for example, representing working class characters, you don't make them talk the Queen's English, you make them talk in, I don't know, Cockney or something. So another, like the slogan of the Imagist movement was "Make it new, make it new." If you're not making it new, then you failed for Pound et al. Another period that characterizes modernist and postmodernist aesthetics, surrealism, which plays with the aesthetics or the feelings, the atmosphere of the dream. So surrealism seeks to represent the operations of the unconscious mind. So seeks to lend a dreamlike quality to everyday experience. Also a nightmarish quality to everyday experience in response to the nightmarish quality of historical events as well. Another thing that characterizes modernist and postmodernist aesthetics, psychological realism and the commitment to mundane experience and an ordinary mind on an ordinary day. And we also see this again in the works, for example, by James Joyce in Dubliners, which represents various characters in the city of Dublin, and this employment, like the use of stream of consciousness as a literary technique. So, stream of consciousness seeks to capture the operation of the mind and all of its mundane preoccupations and all of its twists and turns, and so on. Okay, so again, these are some of the characteristics of modernist and postmodernist aesthetics. Next, we go. Oh, this slide is lost. A slide on Pax Americana. Uh, this is not really relevant to our discussion, so I'll skip it. But this is basically in relation to the shifting geopolitics that also happened in the 20th and the 21st centuries. And in terms of geopolitics, maybe the most significant or one of the most significant events, aside from the world wars and decolonization, was the fall of the British Empire and the rise of the US Empire. So now we go to, and this is the last part of the discussion, yay. Now we go to just a few key points that are written in Frederick Jameson's essay on the postmodern condition. In his essay, Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, Jameson stresses a number of points about what characterizes the postmodern condition. So again, as I discussed earlier, there are a lot of continuities between modernism and postmodernism. Usually, the postmodern period is, although in this essay, Jameson also discusses the problem with periodization, but in conventional periodizations, the postmodern period is usually dated to the end of World War II because of the subsequent destabilizations that World War II introduced. So, in the modern period, these destabilizations in the modern period, again, like 1900s to 1940s, destabilizations in the realm of uh, culture were often traced to, or you could trace it to technological developments, to scientific developments, to um, philosophical development. So these were the sources of destabilization and challenges to the old realities. But World War II introduced a new form of destabilization because World War II led to, again, the waning of the British Empire, the rise of new nation states after periods of decolonization, and the result of that of this post-colonial condition and how it affected literature. Here we see the relationship between post-modernity and post-coloniality. Because the post-colonial condition is characterized by hybridity and also by ambivalent feelings about the colonial experience, where the colonized subject has been taught to aspire to imbibe, to to adopt the values and the norms and the knowledges and the truths and the culture of the colonizer, right? But with post-coloniality, you grapple with that condition of desiring to be like the colonizer and the awareness that you can never be like the colonizer because, well, you're not white or you're not British or whatever. So you grapple with that desire and with this competing desire to construct an identity for yourself in the wake of decolonization and the rise of a new nation, the new post-colonial nation state. Like if you were to distinguish modernity from post-modernity, you will one way of distinguishing that again is the break between World War II and the post-colonial period, the wave of decolonization that happened after World War II, and what that resulted to. The explosion or the multiplicity of voices on the global stage as the formerly colonized people claimed voices for themselves, traveled to the metropolitan centers, be it London or New York, started writing about their own experiences, dominated academic institutions in order to produce knowledge about the colonial condition or the colonial context. So that's one way of distinguishing modernity from postmodernity. Another way of distinguishing modernity from postmodernity could be the development of neoliberal capitalism and how the debates and how the Cold War fits into that. Because another thing that distinguishes postmodernity from modernity is in postmodernity, more so than modernity, you had a greater distrust of the grand totalizing narratives. Marxism, communism, capitalism, these are also grand totalizing narratives. So if you recall in the essay by Jameson, he says or he points out that the problem with these totalizing narratives is that the more totalizing your view of society is, the more totalizing your view of global society and global systems are, the more pessimistic your outlook can become. Because in the face of this totality, it's difficult to see agency when you are overwhelmed by your vision of totality. But if you look at the essay by Jameson, he proposes like five main ways of characterizing the symptoms of the postmodern condition. The first one would be what he proposes as the weakening of historicity, both personal and public, or the weakening of our sense of history and our place in it. And this is caused by a number of factors. Recall again that during modernity, you still had a stronger sense of historicity because cultural production then, as following Woolf and following, for example, Eliot and James Joyce, was shaped by your knowledge of existing previous literary tradition. So, again, that dialogue between antiquity and contemporaneity was something that characterized modernist aesthetics. But in the postmodern condition, we are inundated by so much information, like the contraction of space, the acceleration of time, the multiplicity of voices and images. Often, the age of mechanical reproduction, to quote Walter Benjamin. So the postmodern condition is characterized by mass production, mass consumption, mass circulation through mass communication and mass transportation. So we are inundated by so many images, by so much information, by so many events, by so much knowledge. And often, these knowledges, these events, these images, these spectacles, they are removed from their context when they come to us. So, for example, a white singer like Miley Cyrus, for example, a white singer's appropriation of Black culture is something that is characteristic of the postmodern condition. Like, never mind that for centuries, white people in the United States demonized and like negated Black culture. Now it's cool to do that if it sells albums. So this uncritical mixture, this often uncritical mixture of different forms from different contexts and different places without any reference to their historical context. This is one characteristic or one symptom for Jameson of the postmodern condition. So this weakening of our historical consciousness, the decontextualization of things when things become commodities and circulated. Yeah. So for instance, another example would be like the global circulation of K-pop, where you have a lot of K-pop also draws on Black culture, on Caribbean culture, on Indian musical ragas, mga ganyan. But they're all mixed together. Like yeah, like hybridity, pastiche is what Jameson uses to describe it. So on the public level, there is that weakening of history. Um, Also relativism in history, following the awareness that our experience of reality depends on our positioning in society. But there's also the weakening of our personal sense of history, the confusion in ourselves of how to identify ourselves and how to weave memory together. So, for instance, even the question of identity has become so multiple that the weaving of a narrative of self becomes difficult. The sequencing of events in time to tell the story of the self, considering that the construction of ourself was influenced by so many things, not just our community, but all of the cultural things that we imbibe and consume. And it's difficult to locate ourselves in history, given that history is so complicated. I don't know if I'm making sense, but um, that is what Jameson characterizes as the schizophrenia of the modern subject. I'll just read some of the notes that I wrote in relation to this particular point, because it might make more sense. So Jameson, in the essay Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, written in 1984, argued that the postmodern condition is characterized by the dehistoricization and commodification of cultural objects. The weakening of the sense of history in postmodernity pertains or refers to one's consciousness of public history as well as the forms of our private temporality. The lack of historical sense results in a subjective condition akin to schizophrenia. Drawing on Lacan, Jameson defines the schizophrenic condition as a breakdown in the signifying chain, that is, the interlocking series of signifiers which constitutes an utterance or a meaning. When that relationship breaks down, the links of the signifying chain snap, and we have a schizophrenia in the form of a rubble of distinct and unrelated signifiers. So, for instance, when remember again how signification is often organized and controlled by discourses. In the age of postmodernity, all of these discourses mix, such that a single signifier can have multiple meanings. And sometimes the specific meaning gets lost in the interlocking chains of various signifiers. Um, and this you can relate to intertextuality, referentiality. One thing can mean multiple things. So again, the schizophrenic condition is characterized by the breakdown in the signifying chain, which also leads to a breakdown in meaning and meaning making. So when you read a lot of postmodern texts, they play with this sense of the breakdown of meaning. Since we make sense of ourselves and our place in history through language, this breakdown in signification also leads to a loss of biographical sense making. I quote, personal identity is itself the effect of a certain temporal unification of past and future with the present before me. And such active temporal unification is itself a function of language. If we are unable to unify the past, present, and future of the sentence, then we are similarly unable to unify the past, present, and future of our own biographical experience or psychic life, unquote. In this situation of temporal confusion, space rather than time becomes the more important field of cognition, political consciousness, and cultural representation. I'll talk more about that later. So basically, difficult to unify past, present, and future because we are no longer existing in one linear narrative. In postmodernity, we are no longer following one historical narrative of linear development. We in postmodernity is characterized by the coexistence of multiple narratives, multiple realities, multiple times. As we see, for example, in an even development, where in a single country like the Philippines, you will see the vestiges of a feudal society, even as some parts of the country might be hyper capitalist, participating in global financial capital, etc. So we see in postmodernity the layering on each other of different contexts, different meanings, different temporalities, different narratives of development. So the coexistence of that. So with that complexity, it becomes more difficult for us to plot events in a clear historical narrative. And that is also influenced by the difficulty of learning all of these complex histories. So that contributes to our weakening sense of history. And we see that in discourses on historical revisionism. There are, depending on what your standpoint and perspective is, there could be a different history for the same set of external events because history itself is a narrative. And that narrative in the postmodern period becomes more complex because of, again, the recognition that our realisms are fictive, are fictional. Fictional not in the sense that they never happened and we just came up with them out of nothing. Fictiveness in the sense that whenever you narrativize something, you are arranging them in a particular way and interpreting them in a particular way. So that's the fictive nature of our narratives. Not that we made them up, but that we interpret them differently depending on our particular context. So, Jameson states that this weakening of historicity, not simply, but largely because of the complexity of our modern age or of our contemporary age, is one feature of the postmodern condition. Another feature of the postmodern condition is the breakdown of the distinction between high and low culture. So this distinction arose during the period of high modernism at the end of the Victorian period, where you had so in the early modern period, the period of high modernism, what distinguished high and low culture? Low culture was for mass production, mass consumption, mass enjoyment. Low culture explicitly served the demands of cultural production, of capital, whereas high culture was did not serve supposedly the ethos of capital. So so high culture arrogated to itself uh, the dissension, the questioning and challenging of society, the creation of new belief systems. So the avant-garde, ganyan, high culture. But in the postmodern condition, this distinction breaks down because in the postmodern condition, all artistic production is subsumed to the demands of capital and the system of capitalism. So then you don't have high and low culture anymore because everything has been consumed, or everything has been absorbed by the logic of capital. So yeah, that's something that characterizes the postmodern condition for Jameson. Third, the postmodern condition is characterized by a new depthlessness, uh, characterized by literal flatness or qualitative superficiality and multiple surfaces. So, literal flatness, when you see, for example, glass windows on skyscrapers, like if the early modernist period was concerned with interiority, the postmodern condition characterized by no by an interrogation even of the notion of the self. And maybe an easy way to understand this is by contrasting our sense of self in the 19th century way. Like think the notion of self as biographical. So think of autobiography, think of Bildungsroman, think of Jane Eyre. So the 19th century understanding of the self still roots the self and the self's biography in the events that happened in one's life. So think of Jane Eyre telling us about her childhood, her education. The 19th century of self is a coherent self. Now it's easy to narrativize like that Jane Eyre turned out like this because of her experiences like this. Interiority, deeper meanings, the sublime, these all become suspect in the postmodern condition, partly because of new ways of conceiving of and representing the self. But there's also what I pointed out earlier as the skepticism of the old certainties. So that also contributes to the sense of superficiality. Um, there's also the awareness or this overarching idea that there is no outside to ideology and textuality, meaning that this notion of there is no outside to ideology and textuality is influenced by the notion of the fictiveness of our realities. So if reality is essentially fictive, if there is no objective positivist world out there but only what we represent of it through what we perceive of it, then reality depends on how it is represented by the text and by ideology or ways of looking and seeing and making sense of the world. So the this new superficiality, I know how to explain it now. This distrust of essences, essentialism, essential being, what we have are appearances in its textual form or its ideological rendering, how it is explained by ideologies like Marxism, feminism, or what have you. So this new depth, and Jameson calls this the new depthlessness. There's no more essence, or the very idea of essence, sublime, sublimity, what is deeper, is challenged. You can also relate this to the board's idea of the society of the spectacle, where we're so inundated by images, spectacles, that we no longer are able to easily distinguish between what is real and what is merely a simulation, a simulation of the real. So when you are no longer able to clearly distinguish the real from a simulation of the real, then we have entered the society of the spectacle. So this is also related to this experience as interacting with multiple surfaces, images. I don't know if I'm making sense. If I'm not making sense, please bring this up again during our revision session so I can help clarify these points. Konti na lang. Number 4, the waning of affect and the emergence of new intensities. This is partly because of, again, the questioning of belief in essences and questioning of the coherent and biographical self through which you can explain emotion and emotional responses. So intensities here refer to the awareness that sometimes what we feel may not have any biographical or coherent explanation. Because an emotion is something that is rationalized. You can explain why you are feeling that particular way. Like, I am angry because somebody slammed the door in my face and I didn't even do anything to them. Or I'm sad today because I got a low score on an important examination. Intensity may not have a rational explanation. You just feel it. And this intensity here could, at least in Jameson's text, is partly explained by the hallucinogens of the modern age. So earlier in this presentation, I talked about drug culture. For example, the use of psychedelics as a way to experience reality in a different way. So the use of psychedelic drugs or psychoactive drugs could lead you to feel certain things that have no rational biographical explanation for them. Like, you just feel them. But may also be related to our constant exposure to and consumption of different spectacles and stimuli, because we live in a society of images and we're constantly exposed to different images, and our often unconscious and uncritical consumption of these images can also lead to for certain feelings to arise without our knowing or being conscious of our coming to feel them. Number 5, another thing that is a symptom of the postmodern condition: new technologies that serve the new economic system. So again, for Jameson, what are the overarching characteristics of the postmodern condition? Dehistorization, or the weakening of our historical sense, and the subsumption of everything to the logic of capital. Whereas in earlier ages, that might not be the case. That the logic of capital, of growth, of productivity, of profit, that may not be the driving ethos of other ages. It could be honor, it could be love, it could be nation. But in the postmodern age, everything becomes subsumed to the logic of capital. And even the development of new technologies serves to serve the logic of capital. And for Jameson, that is what characterizes the postmodern condition. In Jameson's text, what is the cure for 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 the trend or pattern of dehistorization and the commodification of everything? For Jameson, the cure is to promote an aesthetics of cognitive mapping, which is encapsulated by his slogan, always historicize everything. This, by the way, is addressed to the cultural critic primarily, but it is also addressed to the cultural producer. Like this essay by Jameson, Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, is a partner essay with another essay titled Third World Literature in the Era of Multinational Capitalism. So this essay, Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, is best paired with Jameson's other major essay, Third World Literature in the Era of Capitalism, where he argues that the task of a cultural producer, a writer at this time, is to represent reality in a way that helps the reader have a firmer grasp of the historicity and the historicity of contemporary reality or contemporary problems, however you may interpret that reality or contemporary problem. So, according to Jameson, a model of a political culture appropriate to our own situation will necessarily have to raise spatial issues as its fundamental organizing concern. Why spatial issues? Because there is this awareness that people are embedded within localities, and the feature of one local context, or the features, the history, the culture, the knowledge of one local context, the conditions of one local context can vary from the conditions of other contexts. So in the postmodern condition, universalism, universal truths, universal humanity, like these universal ideas, no longer hold, because we are aware that in a world where you have multiple realities, multiple contexts, our experience is not the same. We have multiple experiences, multiple identities, multiple contexts. And often, the multiplicity of our experience depends on the specific conditions of the localities that we are in. So for Jameson, um, in order to counter the dehistoricizing, schizophrenic, and commodifying tendencies of the postmodern condition, we have to represent and understand reality in a way that embeds it within its historical and local context. Okay, so again, for Jameson, the cultural producer may counter dehistoricization and alienation by the practical reconquest of a sense of place and the construction or reconstruction of an articulated ensemble which can be retained in memory and which the individual subject can map and remap along the moments of mobile alternative trajectories. So what Jameson is proposing here is that the challenge for the modern cultural producer is to create representations of reality in a way that helps us understand it better within its historical context, such that when we encounter complex reality, we can already have a model for understanding that complex reality. And this proposal again comes with the awareness that some of the old totalizing narratives, including Maoism, Marxism, liberalism, mga ganyan, or Catholicism, the old narratives are no longer adequate to understand the complexity of contemporary experience. So for him, again, postmodernity, the challenge for postmodern cultural producers is to create a map of reality that people can use to ground themselves and understand their place within it. So I'm going to end this here. This is my revision of the modern and postmodern periods, and I will upload this discussion once Google is done with processing it. Uh, I will also upload timestamps. So thank you for your attention if you had paid attention to this super long lecture discussion. And I hope to see you in our succeeding um, sessions, at least on December 16th. So again, we'll have a revision session on December 16th so that you're not left like floundering throughout the course. Again, thank you for paying attention. I hope I made some sense and that you got something from this super long discussion. And see you next time.